Hi, everyone. Welcome to MacGill Summer School 2025. My name is Vincent McCarthy. I'm the director of MacGill Summer School. This year marks the 45th MacGill Summer School, which is founded by Dr. Joe Mulholland to celebrate the life of Patrick MacGill, the poet, and also to bring together thought leaders to discuss the critical issues facing Ireland, Europe, and our world. 2025, when you look at around the world at the moment, we see crises, we see conflict, we see war, we see uncertainty, we see a lot of environmental challenges, and in some respects, people might say, these are themes we've seen over the past number of years. But 2025 does feel different. Something is shifting under the sands, something deeper is happening. Some people describe it as the end of the international rules-based order. That might be true. I think us at MacGill this year, we've called it fracturing. There's a fracturing taking place in the world. Something deeper is happening. And that's not just at a global level, that's at a local level as well, so we can see it in our communities. When we look at the United States of America, we can see them go in their own direction. It seems to be a direction, and they have the ambition to go a way that's different to Europe and maybe different to where Ireland wants to go. We also see China and Russia going their own way. What does this mean for Ireland, and what does this mean for Europe? We've seen a lot of people talk about the idea that we need to become more transactional in our relationship with the US, especially when it comes to trade and tariffs. And I think when we think about our values and our potential as a country, we have to think about it. Does transaction mean that it's good tactically? Is that good for us in trade? But is it good strategically for us as a country to think that way? We've brought together over 45 speakers from around the world and around Ireland to discuss that idea, but also to look at China, United Ireland, our constitution, and we have the upcoming presidential elections as well on Saturday evening, which should be very good. When we look at the programme across the 3 days, we see all these issues, we see all these discussions, but for anyone that filled in the survey last year as well, we did listen to your feedback. You'll see that arts is part of our programme. We have the great Lada Sharma, who will be doing her performance tomorrow evening. She's also on the Fractured Communities panel, which should be very good. We've also looked at the amenities around the village, so we've worked really hard. You'll see the bunting everywhere at the moment. Obviously, Donegal is in the All-Ireland final. We're all going to be supporting Donegal. Probably not Brigid, though, who's going to be supporting Kerry. But, yeah. And many other people too, of course. Three anyway. And I think also, so obviously we don't have the weather today, but Donegal is always very beautiful, so we're very fortunate with that. So we've worked really hard. You'll see a coffee cart outside, up close to the hotel. We have the thatch open this year, which is really important for lunch and dinner. And we might even have an ice cream van appearing one of the days as well, hopefully with the good weather. Another thing we've tried to do as well, we've tried to streamline the programme. It's really tough with MacGill, to be honest, because we want to pack in as much as possible, but we've tried to streamline it a bit so you have a bit more time to chat and network and discuss, which is really good. To make this programme happen, it takes a lot of people to make it happen, come together to make it so good and to get us ready for launch. There's a lot of people I need to thank, and I'll do that at the end, but I just definitely at the start want to note the board of directors who do a lot of hard work across the year. We've Chair Owen Clear, we've Shay Garvey, we've Fiona Naughton here as well, and we've James O'Malley as well, who does a lot of work as well on production. We've Michael Gallagher here locally as well, he's at the back, who does all the work with the local organising committee. All these people work behind the scenes, and sometimes it's invisible. It's governance, it's administration, it's finance, but all this gets us ready to launch, which is really important. So we do want to thank all them. So please give them a round of applause first to start off. Thank you so much. Now, we also have a fantastic partner we've been working with over the last number of years, the University of Notre Dame. It's really good to have such a great partner who support us in loads of ways, but they do really go above and beyond. And what's great about, I call them a true partner in University of Notre Dame, they're ambitious for us, and that ambition pushes us every year. It makes us better, makes us think more about what we're doing, and hopefully makes a greater impact on you, but also the country. They have a huge contingent here today, which is always really lovely. We're delighted to have them. And I'd like to welcome up on stage the Marilyn Keough, Dean of the Keough School of Global Affairs at University of Notre Dame. Please give her a huge round of applause for Professor Mary Gallagher.
Thank you. Thanks, Vince. I was told about 32 years ago when I was on my honeymoon in Nova Scotia that I pronounced my name incorrectly. So it's good to be introduced as Mary Gallagher instead of how everyone in the United States says my name. But I want to welcome everyone here today. It's actually, despite my name, my first time in Donegal, and it's actually my first time in Ireland. Being an expert in U.S.-China relations and Chinese politics has not brought me to Ireland very often, if ever. I'm really happy to welcome you all. I'm really impressed with the program, the extent of the discussions, how deep it's going. And the University of Notre Dame is very proud to sponsor the event, which has been, as I understand it, for many years, a premier forum for open and productive conversations about the island's future. Notre Dame has a long and special relationship with Ireland, and today our commitment to that relationship is stronger than ever, although I can't maybe say that about the current administration in DC. That commitment is reflected in many ways, including through the Keough Institute, which is part of the School of Global Affairs at the university. The Keough Institute is a global leader in the study and teaching of Irish language, Irish literature, and history, as well as research that can help inform public policy on the island in real time. The Keough School itself brings together institutes working across the globe on issues such as peace, democracy, sustainability, human dignity, and the Keough Institute is a critical part of our mission. One of the Institute's signature programs is ARINS, an academic initiative established with the Royal Irish Academy to commission independent, nonpartisan, and multidisciplinary research and analysis on the most fundamental issues facing people in Ireland, both in the North and the South. Thank you again for being here. I'm so glad to join, and I'm so interested to hear the discussion, not just about the part of the world that I know best, China, but also to hear about how Ireland is dealing with this very fraught time period we're in, as Vince talked about, fracturing both at the global and the local level. I'm really impressed with the dialogue, and I'm so happy that this is going to continue with Notre Dame's participation and partnership, and to see the diversity of viewpoints and the spirit of openness among the participants, that is, of course, all of you here, bring to this forum. So let the conversation begin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. I'd also like to thank Donegal County Council, who give us a huge amount of support as well, and Dara, who's on the decks over there, does live streaming and recording. So this Donegal help us support this work as well, that we are here in Donegal, but also we connect out to people across Ireland and around the world. So we welcome everyone who's here digitally to watch us here today in these discussions. For the first time this year as well, we're really thankful for the support of the Irish Academy of Engineering. Really appreciative that they can support MacGill and its mission. And we have their president, Sean Finlay, who will be on the discussion for Ireland's Business Model 2.0 before lunchtime. So that's positive news that we're growing our partnerships as well, which is always good. Now, we're talking a lot about fracturing, and in some sense you can get a bit pessimistic and negative about the way the world is. When Joe set up MacGill originally, when I chatted to him about his original ideas for MacGill, it was to get to Ireland to think long-term and think strategically. And I think at the root of that was an optimism that Joe had about the possibility of where Ireland could be in the future. And if you look over the past 45 years, Ireland's come a long way. We've done a lot of great things, we've done everything brilliant, but we are advancing every year. And I think for us here at MacGill, what we want to do is create these discussions and obviously analyse everything that's happening, but understand that at the root of it, there's an optimism about it. We still have our own agency to choose our own destiny, and we need to make an understanding of what's under our control and what's not under our control. And hopefully through MacGill, in some small way, we'll achieve a better future for all of us together on the island of Ireland. You can clap at that too, so that's really fun. Now, I need to do a few safety things before we start the opening session, and then I didn't do this last year. So you've got all the exits with the green lights above them, and the exit you came in. You have the bathrooms down the back, so please turn off your mobile phones and put them on silent before the sessions begin if you can. If you need any help, you'll see a lot of the team are wearing the black T-shirts, so if you need anything, just please ask them. And hopefully you enjoy the next few days and have fun and interact, and hopefully you get to meet really interesting people. I'd like to welcome our speakers on our panel up onto stage behind me as we get started with the opening session. We have a fantastic panel. The idea of the opening session is, in some sense, to help us frame the entire 3 days. We've got an amazing panel to do that. It's called A Fractured World because that's the theme of MacGill. To do that, you need a really good host and a fantastic guide to help us navigate a fractured world. And I'm delighted to welcome Assistant Professor in the History of War since 1945 at University College Dublin, and Adjunct Senior Research Fellow at the Azure Security Forum. Would you please give a huge round of applause for the great and amazing Dr. Edward Burke. Thank you.
Thank you. see if is this on okay? Yeah, excellent. Okay, delighted to be here. Thank you so much to the people of Donegal, to MacGill, to Notre Dame, to Vince. It's already been just a wonderful welcome, and already there's a celebratory mood in the air in anticipation, of course, of a certain day at Croke Park. My job is to, unfortunately, as I often do as a historian of war, is to bring the tone down from the optimistic, sort of happier, bunting-like mood that we've witnessed in Glenties so far. And but in doing so, I want to sort of bring your attention to the man, of course, whom the summer school is called, Patrick MacGill, ex-1st Battalion London Irish Rifles, who 110 years ago was at the Battle of Loos, right? And in 1915. I just want to read just a little bit what MacGill said. He said, in terms of his memories of the Battle of Loos, I had a clear personal impression of man's ingenuity for destruction when my eyes looked on the German front line where our dead lay in peace with their fallen enemies in the parapet. At the bottom of the trench, the dead lay thick, and our boys engaged in building a new parapet were heaping the sandbags on the dead men and consolidating the captured position. There are means by which we are going to end this war, I said. Did you see the dead and wounded today, the men groaning and shrieking, the bombs flung down into the cellars, the blood-stained bayonets, the gouging and the grueling? All those things are means towards creating peace in a disordered world. And that's very much what MacGill sort of set his attention to doing. He was very aspirational about not ever having to repeat that disordered world that he had witnessed, the gouging and the grueling, the anarchy that he had seen and experienced. And so MacGill was absolutely realistic about the poverty, the inequality, the fractured or disordered world that he found himself in, including after the First World War, but he remained resolutely optimistic. And so I think, that's very much to build on what Vince is saying, is what we're about here too, is kind of we're accepting the world as it is. We're accepting the threats to democracy, to, truth, to global order, a system in which we place values on, the United Nations, international law. We're accepting the reality as we find them, but we're also trying to look for better ways forward. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined in this first panel to talk about MacGill's, the re-emergence perhaps of this more disordered world or fractured world, as MacGill, the warnings that Patrick MacGill left us. I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by two superstars of my profession. The first is Mary Gallagher. Mary is a professor of global affairs and the Marilyn Keough, Dean of the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. Previously, Mary directed the International Institute at the University of Michigan, and she has published, really extensively throughout the international media, the New York Times, Washington Post. She's the author of 5 absolutely groundbreaking, very well-received books, including Authoritarian Legality in China, Law Workers in the State, Contagious Capitalism, Globalization and the Politics of Labour. And so her age expertise is phenomenal and really world recognized. She has received multiple honours. I just really don't have time to get into them. But she's also a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings. She's worked for she's been a consultant for the World Bank, the US State Department. You get the picture. Okay, so we're in good hands. Similarly, my former UCD colleague, it's a great honour to have Professor Brigid Laffan here. Brigid Laffan is, of course, the Chancellor of the University of Limerick, an emeritus professor at the European University Institute, and she was a director and professor at the Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies and director of the Global Governance Programme and the European Governance and Politics Programme at the European University Institute in Florence until her retirement in August 2021. We're extraordinarily proud of her service in UCD as Professor of European Politics at the School of Politics and International Relations, Vice President, of course, of UCD, and Principal of the College of Human Sciences for many years as well. So, again, there's so many awards here that we can't get through them all, or else we'd be up in our time. But including, awards from the President of France for her academic and public policy impact. She's also from Kerry, but we won't get into that actually, because as a West Corkman, my Donegal sympathies might become very apparent. So, Brigid, Mary, we're living through this era whereby, we have interconnected conflicts in Ukraine, we have tensions and competition in the Pacific, the Middle East, Africa. These all seem, as I say, increasingly interconnected. Democracies are undoubtedly corroding. They're in retreat. Disinformation is a rampant virus. And, of course, the climate emergency is worsening. So how bad are things? I mean, and where do we go from here?
So I think it's important to distinguish in the first instance between deep structural change in our world, and there are very significant deep changes. These are the sort of cyclical changes that happen every 50 years, every 100 years. That's obviously driven by technology, the climate crisis, demography, hypermobility. All of this the world confronts regardless of the actors. But then added to that, we live in a world where the strong man has re-emerged in our world. We have too many of them. They may not in the end be particularly strong, but they certainly have a capacity for action that doesn't help. We also live in a world where power structures are shifting dramatically. The US had a golden period after 1989. The Cold War was won. But then that unipolar moment shifted, and now we're in an era of great power competition, and that competition has been there for quite a while, but it's now more acute because of technology, and Mary will speak about China, is much more knowledgeable about China than I am, but China is now a serious great power in technology, its military capacity, all of that. So we now live in a competitive world between these two great powers. And that world, there's a sharpening of the competition, but also, of course, there are shifts in norms. So Patrick MacGill, after the First World War, but more certainly after the Second World War, there was a very strong normative underpinning of global politics, and that was the norm of the non-use of force. Well, we now live in a world where that norm has been radically weakened. So I would say we live in a world where geoeconomics and geopolitics are much more intertwined than they have been. And for Europe, that raises particular challenges. War has returned to our continent. But also Europe, as a part of the world, has multilateralism in its DNA. It is most comfortable with a world that works through the so-called rules-based international system. That's weakening significantly. And it's a world in which Europe, in a sense, outsourced its defense to the United States. And that is no longer a tenable position. So this is a period for Europe that is very challenging. And because, if you think of Ireland, Ireland has historically, in terms of the Irish state, three anchors in the world. Relationship with the United States, relationship with the UK, and membership of the EU. And the only solid anchor left now is membership of the EU. We've been through the Brexit trauma, which was very problematic for this country, stabilising again, and that's a very good thing. And then we engage now with a very uncertain US. We can't even predict beyond the 1st of August what's going to happen. And for Europe, you will hear from now until the 1st of August a lot of talk about trade. It matters. But Europe has two other major concerns. One has to do with Ukraine. If Ukraine cannot survive as an independent state with sufficient sovereignty, I'm not saying all of its territory, but sufficient sovereignty, then the arc of instability will move westwards. And countries like Finland, the Baltics, Poland have reason to be very worried. And the other underlying concern the Europeans have, which you don't hear in the news, is a concern about if the United States financial system becomes unstable with the level of deficits, whether or not the dollar survives as this reserve currency, which has allowed the United States to be extraordinarily promiscuous with its fiscal deficits, then the worry in Europe is we came through the Eurozone crisis, and none of us in this room will ever forget it. there's a concern about financial stability. So when people, and I hear a lot of it, say Europe should be tougher and whatever, the smartest thing the Europeans can do at the moment is stay at that table. Just stay at the table for as long as it can to try to manage as best it can what is a very complex set of challenges.
Thank you very much, Brigid. Mary, I mean, we've talked about this major shift for Washington. Are we seeing in Beijing sort of more of the same, or has there also been a significant move in response to the election of Donald Trump, or an acceleration of trends? What are you seeing in terms of regards to how China, its grand strategy, if you wish, in the world?
Yeah, so, that was a great summary that Brigid, and analysis that Brigid just gave. I totally agree that Europe is in this very difficult spot right now, both on the politics and the economic. Going back just a few months, if we think about what happened at the beginning of the year when China and the United States were in this retaliatory spiral going up to 145% tariffs, and the EU was looking at a summit that was going to happen. It's going to happen now just in a couple of weeks. I think the EU thought it was going to have a good spot for negotiation, and that China would then play this role that China often does, which is China would then come to Europe with open arms and offer Europe something. And then there would be maybe more pressure on the United States through China and the EU being more aligned, and they hadn't been aligned for the last few years. And then China totally blew that up when it's used the critical minerals and rare earths against both the United States and the European Union. But the European Union wasn't just a bystander that was hit by the China's export bans. I think it was directed at Europe directly. And I think it was a message that we're in a totally different new environment. China is emboldened. China is now no longer going to play nice when it comes to the global economy. It's not going to necessarily say, we're here to defend globalization. If the United States is going to blow up the global economy, then China is going to act in a different way. And that means it's going to put a lot of pressure on the EU. I think when China did that with rare earths, it also really uncovered how little leverage the European Union has on its market access, because China not only shut down shut down export of rare earth minerals, it shut down production in Europe, right? So this was a very clear and I think a turning point for EU-China relations and for China's kind of role globally.
Thank you. And a question to you both then. So in terms of, there's been some commentary of late that, on the one hand, we need to stay at the table with the United States, and despite, frankly, the seeming failure of this EU-China summit, also try and sort of, find ways to engage in Beijing, including moving a summit to Beijing that then President Xi doesn't turn up to. This has been a kind of a battering for the European Union. Should we also be conscious that perhaps there is a more malicious attitude in Washington and Beijing towards the European Union, that some perhaps in both capitals view this as an opportunity to maybe even destroy the EU, and that we should be conscious of this?
So, I think that certainly the Trump administration does not like the EU, J.D. Vance's, his Munich speech, but also, if you remember, the chat, it was very disdainful of Europe. I think that's a fundamental historical error by any American administration, and I'll tell you why. If you look at the world today, alliances will matter as great power competition expands. And therefore, for the United States to turn on its friends, in the end of the day, will fail. It will fail. And no American administration should forget that Europe is a very large and very wealthy market. So there's lots of consumers in Europe. So to antagonize Europe beyond a certain level is just not smart. But equally, I would say the same for the Chinese. Because in the end of the day, if China-US trade has more barriers, the Europeans, if China continues to dump in Europe, there will be a reaction. So because Europe tends to base its power, more soft than hard, more comfortable with soft power than hard power. The Europeans are simply not going to go down the tube with style. They will react, and they are reacting. The hedging going on across the world in terms of trade agreements at the moment is very significant. The Europeans are working very Mercosur, delivering on CETA, a trade agreement by the end of this year with India. Europe is not going to lie down and say to the great powers, roll over us. So Europe will, obviously, because of the nature of an entity that is not a state, has 27 governments, it will be slower, more suboptimal, but no one, in my view, should underestimate the spine that's there. And that spine has been hard won as the EU was tested through the Eurozone crisis, the migration crisis, Brexit, the pandemic. This is now a system that's much more resilient than those political scientists who look at power in very traditional terms, tend to think always as the EU weak. The EU does have instruments. It takes a while to get its house in order, and it doesn't always get its house in order. But I don't think for either Beijing or Washington that it is smart politics to undermine one of the stable, wealthy parts of the world, given the nature of the world we're in. So I'm far less pessimistic about Europe. I think Europe will always be messy. It'll always be untidy. It's the nature of the beast. But if you think of the number of small states in the EU, 22 small states, or even Germany, and you think Germany and France can cope with the world without the collective, and we've had the natural experiment. We know what happens. It's called Brexit. It has happened. It has left the United States or the United Kingdom much poorer than it would otherwise be. So again, I think we need to be careful in terms of, because there's so much happening, that we're not locked into a presentism, that we've got to watch that there are longer trends here. So has Europe reason to be concerned? Absolutely. But to be honest, I don't think there's a capital in the world that hasn't reason to be concerned about the world as it now is.
Yeah, so on the, does the United States want the European Union to disintegrate? I don't think so, and I want to also just recognize that this is one administration. It's going to be in power for the next three and a half years, and it has done a lot already to destroy the alliances. It wasn't Biden's policy, right? Biden's policy was much more about strengthening alliances. However, I do think that there's something going on in the United States around Trump's behavior and the way, and Vance's behavior in speaking directly to Europe, that has shown to be effective. And I worry about that long-term impact that people will say, and I've seen people say this around sort of Biden not getting Europe to increase defense to that degree. Not getting Europe to support Ukraine in the way that the United States wanted it to do. I mean, obviously in discourse supporting, but in terms of military investments. So if we learn that lesson, I think that's the thing right now is what do we learn from the behavior of this administration? Right now, Trump is in a period of victory, right? The tariffs are working. A lot of money coming in. There were reports yesterday in the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times showing like the big increase into the Treasury. He will gloat about that. That will be seen as a victory. And of course, the longer term situation is really different because longer term Europe will react, China will react, India will react, Brazil will react, which just got hit with 50% tariffs because of a political dispute. So I think that's the problem is what are the long-term implications of Trump? Trump is the president that got Europe to commit to defense.
Yeah, and I think in some ways, could I ask both of you then, so has Europe played an unfortunate emboldening role for Trump in that obviously there was quite a number of EU member states that were spending much more than 3.54% of their GDP on defence because they were worried about a Russian invasion. It wasn't because the US was asking them to do, and indeed they spend more of their, a percentage of their GDP than the United States does in defence. So in some ways, by Mark Rutte calling Trump daddy and sort of saying that we prostrating ourselves in front of Trump, is this not emboldening the Trump and Vance and the administration to say, you know what, we can bully the Europeans. They allow themselves to be bullied. I noticed also Europe has moved away from talking about strategic autonomy to now defence readiness, which means that our dependence on the United States is, by some member states, is taken for granted for the next 10 years instead of being any way more ambitious. So this does look like an emboldening moment for Trump, and is it therefore dangerous and that leaks into other things like US-EU trade negotiations?
So I think that's a very valid observation. From the time Obama called the US pivot to Asia, Europeans needed to start working on making Europe more autonomous and less dependent on the United States in defence and security. Warning number one. Warning number two, Trump won. The Europeans did not do enough when they had the time, they had the opportunity, and it was the war in Ukraine. Now the message has dropped. So I would say, so I'm observing very interesting things across the defence and security landscape. Europe actually already spends quite a bit on defence. It doesn't do it very well. Interoperability is very poor. European defence industries are fragmented, not efficient. That's where I think the biggest changes are coming. So for the first time ever, the European Defence Agency is led by a serious military general. It was always a civilian. It's now a military man. Number two, the SAFE programme, which is a procurement programme for defence, requires 60% European content. And interestingly, the American defence industry is no longer talking of developing defence for Europe. It is talking about developing defence with Europe. So there is a shift. It's a bit like the single market. There now will be a strengthening of the single market across the range of capability in defence and security. And companies, both European and outside, will want to be part of this. Why did Canada sign a defence agreement? Why did the UK sign a defence agreement? Because they want their companies in on SAFE. And again, for this country, we've got to get our head out of the sand and realise that in the high-tech area, we have something to offer, and we can't afford not to be part of this. Again, because it is harder for Europe to do this. If you've won government, it's much easier. If you've won army, much easier. But what I see over the next 5 years is an increasing Europeanization of non-nuclear defence. And also remember that Europe has a country that is probably, in terms of innovation in the use of force, way beyond anything available, and that's Ukraine. So we shouldn't, again, I think the Europeans are late to the table, should have learned the lesson 10 years ago, didn't, should have learned the lesson in 16, didn't. I guarantee you there isn't a defence ministry in Europe or a prime minister's or president's office in Europe that isn't mainstreaming defence and security today.
And indeed, on the nuclear defence as well, France and the UK kind of a dialogue and agreement now is remarkable, something we would not have predicted 10 years ago. Mary, do you want to...
Just on, so an alternative explanation of does the American government want to destroy Europe, it could be reverse psychology, right? So the threats to Europe from the United States are driving Europe to more cooperation, right, and to more investment in defense. Now, the Trump administration's intentions and long-term goals, if they exist, are very, very hard to understand, partly because even though it seems like a quite unified government, there are huge divisions within the Trump administration. And there probably are people who are interested in, true sort of disintegration of the European Union. But I think there are lots of people within the administration who are more sort of mainstream, Republicans, pro-defense, pro-military, that really want to see this result in Europe and see it as in the long-term interests of the United States more broadly, that it becomes more united. And it's true, Europe has become, I'm not an expert on the EU, but seems to have become more united through crises, right? Through Brexit, through the global financial crisis. These are things that have driven Europe closer together rather than splitting it apart.
Thank you. So we're going to bring the audience in a minute. I just had two other questions. The first is that obviously we've watched this unilateral action, the United States military attack on Iran. This morning we wake up to news about Israel and Syria and the escalating situation there. Generally speaking, remarkably compared to 20, 25 years ago, the United States, very few European governments stood up and voiced strong concerns about international law when it comes to the military use of force, the United Nations. So we seem to be in a new era where there's a level of just silence about, and does that lead to corrosion then of our institutions? I mean, we've watched the hammering of international aid, we've watched the adversarial attitude of the United States, China and Russia, 3 of the P5 towards the United Nations is very clear. Can the United Nations actually serve the traditional function that it had in the 20th century? Or are we looking at a kind of free fall of this institution and other multilateral institutions? Where are we with regards to multilateralism now and what can be done? Because our government talks about doubling down on multilateralism and making sure that Ireland defends multilateralism. But how do we even think about doing that against this, as I say, 3 of the P5 acting in the way that they are?
So I think that the rules-based international order was never quite as rule-based as we might have hoped, but it was certainly very significant in creating scaffolding around state behaviour. So firstly, the norm on the non-use of force has weakened dramatically. That's the most worrying thing, in my view, in the international system today. And it doesn't help when a president of the United States says he'll take Panama and Greenland by force if necessary. It's just dangerous language. But it's not just that we see dangerous language, we see a lot of dangerous behaviour. There's no doubt international law has weakened. It's never been as strong. I mean, it's not. We tend to think of international law as being the equivalent of domestic law. It's not, because there's always a compliance problem with international law. But that said, it has also weakened. And the worry is that there are problems that cannot be solved through great power politics. The climate crisis is the quintessential challenge that needs cooperation. And so if you weaken multilateralism, you make it much more difficult to deal with issues like the climate crisis. But again, there remains a lot of multilateralism in the system, and there's an awful lot of international law, like the law of the sea, the law of the air, working perfectly. But there are parts that are underwater. The UN has been in trouble, in my view, for quite a while. It's not recent. Stalemate on the Security Council has been there for a very, very long time. The loss of US aid will undermine a lot of agencies, and people. That's again a major source of US soft power to be regretted. But what you do see, that there's another new, not new form of multilateralism, but multilateralism that has always existed but is becoming more important. And that's what I would call coalitions of the willing. That you're getting, not just through formal structures, but you're getting transnational groupings. For example, the BRICS and other examples like this. So there's a lot of movement in the multilateral system at the moment. Why would an Irish foreign minister say, oh, we must, double down on the rules-based international order? It's very obvious. A rules-based international order and international institutions with heft is the best kind of world for small states. the best kind of world for small states, because small states don't have the options or the power. But superimposed on that world that emerged after the Second World War is now a return of hardened great power politics. And it's not just China, US. The Brazilians are, rumbling. The Indians. So it's a very different world and a harder world for small states to navigate. And I always use this anecdote, but it's worth recalling. At Versailles, after the First World War, the calamity of the First World War, Lloyd George turned round to his it was probably Foreign and Commonwealth Office at the time, but anyway, and said, "My man, are we giving away Upper or Lower Silesia today?" That was the world of the Versailles Conference, pre the League of Nations, pre the UN, because of the horror of those two wars. We ended up with a better institutionalized international system. But it's as if we've forgotten the wars and we're now playing roulette with the future of the world. And I'm not a pessimist. And I think, for example, for me, so what happens in Ukraine is the neuralgic point here. There are probably two in Asia. I'm not sure Mary would agree, but I think the South China Sea and Taiwan. They're the two neuralgic. So there are problems in the world that if something goes wrong, the ripple effect can be very serious.
It is striking, actually, Brigid, when you say that. I mean, I remember speaking to Sir Michael Palliser, who was a senior British diplomat, one of the key architects of the European single market, actually.
Yes.
And Michael Palliser asked him, in London, where did your commitment to the EU come from? And he said, on a tank in the Netherlands. And it is interesting that, in terms of a bit like Patrick MacGill, right, as living memory of these two world wars literally is gone, that we are suddenly lurching into this very dangerous kind of game-playing, anarchic threats that are coming from various capitals around the world. I just wanted to, Mary, can you come in there in terms of multilateralism? I mean, you obviously are keeping a very close eye on China as well and its attitudes to the WTO or the United Nations,
Sure.
etc. Yeah.
I think the United States has never been, obviously, a strong supporter of multilateralism that constrains the United States. I think it believes that, I mean, broadly, the governments, whether it's Trump or a different administration, that these institutions were often set up through U.S. hegemony starting after World War II, and that these institutions have been very successful in terms of the economic rejuvenation of Europe, and then, of course, what happened in East Asia, and then finally China. I don't believe that right now the United States believes that these institutions are serving the United States. And that's partly because China has been so adept at using those institutions, including the United Nations, for its own interests. Xi Jinping has a line that he uses a lot, which is, we're seeing changes that we haven't seen in a century. So it really literally going back to World War I. And so even though that comes from the Chinese government, I think the U.S. also is at this point where, and this actually happened during the Obama administration and has continued under Trump, which is we are no longer in a world order that serves the United States' interests, and therefore there needs to be changes. The pivot to Asia, of course, was under Obama. But under Obama as well, two of his staffers wrote an essay in Foreign Affairs called The End of Engagement. So ending the engagement policy with China, which since the beginning of the 1970s had driven Chinese growth and Chinese integration into the global economy. It was successful. I mean, it was successful for many parts of the world. It was successful in many ways for the United States. But it no longer serves the United States well economically, militarily. And so there's, I think, little interest in reviving institutions that only seem to allow Chinese power to grow.
Thank you, Mary. And very finally, just briefly, I mean, obviously in Ireland we have tried to have a dual strategy of talking very loudly about things like the Occupied Territories Bill, at home, but then going to Washington for St. Patrick's Day and not mentioning it or the European Union at all. I mean, I think Washington is beginning to notice, and this is creating creating challenges for us as a foreign policy actor. But we also have a presidency of the European Union coming up,
yes.
Very, very, very quickly coming ahead. And the number one topic on the agenda will still be security and defence for the European Union. These are really big challenges for Ireland's diplomats. Can you sort of say, how can we navigate this?
So Ireland takes over the presidency of the EU on the 1st of July next year. Ireland has traditionally run very good presidencies. The technical preparations are on, they're continuing, they're high calibre. Our representation centre in Brussels is being staffed up. So the Irish system will be able to deal with. For me, what the Irish government is going to have to decide between now and maybe next April is what is the strapline for the Irish presidency? What is our message to the EU in the high politics of the future of the EU? And I don't think we're anywhere close. On the Occupied Territories Bill, it's been around since 2018. In a world of such utter uncertainty, drawing attention to yourself in Washington might not be smart. And that doesn't in any way negate the extraordinary normative dimension to all of this. But I was very struck in the Irish Programme for Government, which was just before the arrival in office of Trump. And if you look at the page on foreign policy, 4 paragraphs on values, about 1 on interests. We're a small state. We've limited influence. We must use our influence cleverly. I would much prefer to see us on Israel to work our way through the EU because there is now a very serious debate at EU level on Israel, and the EU has managed to extract from the Israelis more humanitarian aid in the last week, getting into Gaza. So that's effectiveness. Symbolic politics might make us feel good about the world, but unless it changes people's lives on the ground, you should not expend hard-earned diplomatic capacity. And I worry a little that, the kind of romantic Ireland that we like to assure ourselves we're good people, we need to just be a bit more hard-nosed. And I know the reaction saying things like this in this country gets, but I think we have to be able to have those conversations.
Thank you, Brigid. Mary, did you want to say anything else? So we've got time. We're running a little bit behind schedule, so we've got time for a few questions. So we've got a gentleman there with his hand up. If you just briefly say your name and then answer the question.
Hi, my name is Alex Piggott. And just, that was massive in terms of what you talked about. It's such a huge amount of information and what you were saying. But just come back to the original point of this discussion, which is our fractured world. And to ask the question, how did we get there? And what should we do to bring it back to a less fractured world? And figure out, how did it... So, from my view, what we look at, say we go back to before the Iraq War, the United States are looking for Hans Blix to go and do his investigation in Iraq to find out if there's weapons of mass destruction. The United States goes to the United Nations and looks for a resolution that means that there will be military action in Iraq, sees that they can't get it, so there's a coalition of the willing. And so that is, I think, the beginning of our fractured world, because they undermine the United Nations. The United States pays a third of the United Nations budget, and they haven't paid anything to the United Nations for nearly 2 years now. So should we not look at how do we fix this? If the United States doesn't want to be a member of the United Nations, maybe let's move out of New York to somewhere else. Is that the future? Do we look at BRICS and say there's an organization that's actually starting out? Do we all move to them and leave the United States alone? Or do we just threaten this to try and bring them back? So that's the question to the panel. How do we bring ourselves back to a less fractured world, rather than the solution, which I think he said was, let's stick with the United States, buy lots of their weapons, and make sure that we're military, geared up for any attack. Thank you.
Might just take another question here as well. So.
Morning. My name is John McGrain. Thanks for a great conversation. Just focus on a particular detail. Among the many things that we forget happened at the early stages of this madness phase of the last 6 months was a new accord between China, Japan and South Korea, which nobody really talked about at all at that stage. And I'm interested in your point of view in terms of what's really going on behind Russia's move on Ukraine from China itself, and to the wider point from both yourself, Mary, and Brigid about what's happening on Europe's eastern axis. What does China make of Europe's eastern axis? Thanks.
So we can take one more and then we'll go for a round of answers and then we better wrap it up. Yeah, we have a question there from this lady in the fourth row.
Hi, a very interesting panel, but I wanted to ask about something that didn't go mentioned. I wondered if any of you have noted that, as well as becoming more militarised in the last say decade, few years or so, the European Union has also become, if I can use some biased wording, a lot crueler. So I'm thinking of principally the European Union's attitude towards migrants. And I just wanted to point out that Donald Trump's policies towards migrants have actually resulted in a backlash among the American people. So a recent poll showed that 70% of Americans now believe that immigration is a good thing, and there is sky-high support now for citizen pathways instead of mass deportations. But the European Union's, so Frontex has been contributing to the drowning of thousands of people in the Mediterranean since 2015, to the point where fish that we eat from the Mediterranean has actually been fattened off of human bodies. And there is absolutely no discontent in the European European body politic about this. In fact, it seems that individual states are competing almost to see who can deport more, who can enact the most punitive measures, who can lock up their borders the tightest, to the actual point where it's starting to affect the Schengen area and the concept of common travel, because there are panics about people coming in from other areas of the EU to commit crimes or whatnot. And I did want to know what you guys' thoughts on that is, because that is, I think, a major difference between the EU and the US, is that the US's migrant policies actually draw backlash, and in the EU we have policies at an even more advanced level of harshness and cruelty and almost depravity, and it's basically crickets. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll start with you, Mary, actually, and then if you want to just
Sure.
Point out which comment you're responding to as you go, then thank you.
Yeah, just on the first comment, which going back to the Iraq War in the early 2000s, I think that's the wrong place to start. I think we need to go back farther, and I think some of the things that Brigid said at the beginning related to kind of structural changes are really important to think about, because it's those structural changes in the size of the economies, in demographic changes, both in the United States and China and Europe for that matter, Japan and Korea. So going back to these structural changes in the economy, I think really help us then understand how did the United States get to Trump 1, and how did we get to Trump 2, which is an even more interesting question. But on the solution, for Ireland or for the EU on multilateralism, I don't think multilateralism will work. If you think about great power competition, which is what we are in now, none of the countries that are alternatives to the United States are reliable. Right? If you're thinking about China as reliable, China has shown with rare earths it is not reliable. Right? Russia, of course, with the invasion in 2022 of Ukraine. So I don't think that the question is what other body will suffice. It's really about what does Europe do as an entity in and of itself. And I do think that does relate to defense resilience. What was the new word? Readiness. Defense readiness. And then just on the migration issue, which was the third question, I have to say, it is true that there will be a backlash against Trump's policies. I'm pretty sure of that in the midterm elections and then in the next presidential election. And hopefully that will lead to a new migration policy that allows for pathways to citizenship. I think voters are supportive of that. But getting there is going to be difficult. A lot of the consequences of Trump's budget changes, particularly on the poor and the middle class, only go into effect after the midterms. So we could be in for a long slog before anything changes on U.S. migration.
And Mary, did you want to briefly say something about the Asia, sort of the Korea, Japanese, and the China relationship there in terms of where you see that?
The accord that you mentioned, I wasn't quite sure which one. I mean, I think generally speaking, Korea and Japan are in similar positions to the EU in terms of figuring out what their relationship will be with the United States, at least during this administration, where there is not a big support for alliances. And of course, Japan and the US are in a really hard spot right now with their own summit blowing up. On the other hand, I do not believe Korea and Japan will see China as a long-term partner. There's just way too much security risk for them both.
Thank you. Brigid, do you want to?
So firstly, on the sort of an anti-US coalition, it would be extraordinarily difficult to put it together. I can't see the circumstances in which that would happen. The variation across the globe is just too great. The divergence are too great. And the United States remains the most powerful country in the world. So dealing with the US is a necessity for all countries in the world, including China, the EU. It's a question of how this pans out. I think broadly MAGA fails. The question is when and with what damage. And it will and already has undermined US soft power in the world, but Trump is feeling strong just now. So again, it's too early to tell where any of this takes us. Forget the BRICS. So the BRICS, when it was 5 countries of the emerging powers, had some unity. Their intention was to change the international institutions. But now that they've expanded to include Egypt, Saudi, Iran, forget it. I mean, it was interesting that neither Putin nor Xi Jinping went to the BRICS summit. And it's the difference. BRICS is the difference between alliances and loose coalitions. They're very different. So again, I think the world has to cope with Trump and to remember that the US has gone through cycles of this before. This isn't the first period of isolationism. It isn't the first period of wacky politics. So you just have to survive it and manage it and navigate it as smartly as you can with as much adaptability as you can. To John's question on Russia, on China and Ukraine, I think it's a disgrace. I think China has spoken from 2 sides of the mouth. There is no way that North Korean capability is getting into Russia without their agreement. I think they're helping them with tech. And they've also said that Russia is an enduring strategic partner. So the Chinese do not want Russia to lose this war. That would be very bad for China. So I think they're a disgrace on Ukraine, and Western countries are often criticised for their hypocrisy in international politics. All I can say is hypocrisy doesn't start and finish with the West. There's an awful lot of hypocrisy more generally in international politics. And then finally on migration. So if you live in a world that continues to have legal boundaries, which is the world we live in, and if those boundaries encase societies, then there is a legitimacy to managing boundaries and borders. And the time you spoke about, I happen to live in Italy. and I saw the direct consequences of the industry across the Mediterranean of moving people, and mayors of small towns in Italy not knowing what to do. And of course, in typical Italian fashion, they shake their heads and send them north to France. So it's not a trivial issue, the hypermobility of the world we live in. And again, it doesn't help, I'm afraid, and it doesn't even help the cause that you want, which is a liberal migration environment. It doesn't help when you catastrophize it. It doesn't help when you exaggerate. And yes, there are strains in Schengen, and the strains in Schengen are coming from real problems confronted by societies and by politicians on a daily basis. And Putin and Belarus has weaponized migration on the eastern side. So let's at least be clear about what we're talking about. I personally favor legal access, but no, there is no migration policy in the world, either in the US or in Europe, that will allow the kind of mobility of people that would happen if there were no borders at all. There isn't. Borders mean restrictions. Those restrictions are legitimate, and it really doesn't help, in my view, to exaggerate and to talk about it is horrible what happens in the Mediterranean. But people are being put on the boats by people smugglers at an enormous use of funding that if Africa developed, it would be much better for everyone all around. So I think, again, let's not be, there are very tough trade-offs in this policy field, very tough. But denying the difficulties helps no one, and in fact doesn't lead to the kind of successful migration that the world has experienced. But migration is a tough issue, and pretending that you could wipe it away if you got rid of Frontex, you can't. You can't. And I saw it with my own eyes living in Italy in those years.
Okay. So we focused a lot on states and the international system, if you wish, in this panel. Obviously, there's a huge amount to be said for non-state actors, civil society, and I'm pleased that, MacGill, there'll be a lot of people here who will have things to say on that. And indeed, there's room for optimism, whether it's on climate, or whether it's on democracy and civil liberties. There's room for optimism there in terms of global connections, as well as some hard-headed realism as well. So I just want to, we've talked about a disordered, MacGill, or a fractured world, but I think we've had some real coherence today from our two outstanding panelists. So I'd like to ask you to show your appreciation. Thank you. So I'm conscious we need to move on with the agenda. So thank you again for your questions and for your attention.
Thank you. That was great. That was a good job. Very enjoyable.